So, dwarves, those short, sturdy, and angry beings that are built like they were carved directly out of a mountain by someone who was very committed to right angles. Dwarves are the only species in D&D who look like they could survive a cave-in, a bar fight, and emotional repression all at the same time. And yet, despite being one of the most iconic fantasy species of all times, people still don't quite understand them. Today, we fix that. Or at least, we explain it badly. Hello, I'm Sophia from the Kobold Guild, illustrator, dungeon master, lore goblin, and the kind of person who reads fantasy wikis for fun and then wonders why her brain is full of dwarves instead of useful life skills. So welcome back to D&D Explained Badly, the series where I take Dungeons & Dragons lore, history, design, and explain it accurately, but with a tone that suggests I've had 3 cups of tea and have a very strong opinion. Last episode, we tackled the elves, those elegant, dramatic, moisturized forest cryptids with emotional depth that's measured in centuries. And today we're going to swing in the opposite direction. We are going to be talking about dwarves. Dwarves are one of the most fundamental species of fantasy. They predate D&D, Tolkien's popularity, and half the tropes that we now take for granted. And yet, somehow, they've been flattened into short, beard, axe, drink. And which is wildly unfair, and also not entirely wrong. So today we're going to dive deep into the lore, the history, the additions, subraces, cultures, and traits, and why dwarves are one of the most emotionally complex species in D&D. They're just very bad at talking about it. So grab a drink, preferably something strong like whiskey, and let's dig in. The dwarf lore across the editions. Advanced D&D, first edition, or AD&D, depending on what you want to call it, this is where the dwarves were first introduced, and it wasn't trying to be subtle about them. The early edition dwarves were designed with a very clear purpose in mind: go underground, survive terrible conditions, and come back alive. These dwarves were sturdy in a way that felt almost unfair. They were resistant to poison, resistant to magic, resistant to being shoved around, and resistant to whatever nonsense the dungeon threw at them. If elves were designed to dart around the battlefield looking pretty, well, dwarves were designed to stand there and refuse to die just out of spite. In AD&D, dwarves were also deeply tied to lawfulness and tradition, not because the game designers were trying to moralize them, but because dwarves were meant to be dependable, predictable, and, well, solid. The kind of adventurer you bring along because you know they won't panic when the ceiling starts collapsing. They didn't get flashy magic, they didn't get elegant maneuvers, they got grit and stone sense and this natural familiarity with underground environments that basically said, yes, this is my home, and no, you're not welcome. It's also worth noting that early D&D dwarves were very clearly inspired by Tolkien's dwarves. They were proud, stubborn, industrious, and deeply suspicious of anything that wasn't carved from rock. And if an early dwarf player trusted an elf, well, that in itself was character development. This edition set the tone for dwarves forever. They are reliable, they are hard to kill, and they are not impressed by your nonsense. By the second edition, well, this is where dwarves stopped just being good at caves and started being a people. This edition really leaned into dwarven culture, clan structures, ancestral halls, family lineages stretching back centuries, and a cultural obsession with honor that bordered on religious devotion. Dwarves in 2E didn't just remember their ancestors, they consulted them metaphorically and, well, sometimes literally. Grudges became a defining feature here, and not in a funny, petty way. Dwarven cultures were treated as serious social and cultural obligations. If your family was wronged, you just didn't move on. You recorded it, you remembered it, you passed it down, because history mattered, and forgetting was what considered a moral failure. This is also where dwarves became strongly associated with gods of the forge, creation, protection, and endurance. Their religion wasn't about flashy miracles and divine wrath. It was about continuity, about building something that lasts and honouring the works of those who came before them. Emotionally, 2E dwarves were not great at talking about their feelings, which frankly tracks. Loss was handled through ritual, grief through labour, trauma through tradition, and so you didn't cry about a fallen hold, you just rebuilt it stronger. And honestly, there's something quite human in that. By the 3rd edition and its extremely crunchy sibling, 3.5, took all the cultural groundwork and said, right, let's make this mechanically satisfying. This is the era where dwarves became one of the most mechanically reliable species in the game. Constitution bonuses that made them tougher, poison resistance that made them harder to be shut down, and dark vision that kept them very useful underground. And let's not forget stone cunning. It deserves its own precious moment. Stone cunning meant dwarves could instinctively recognize worked stone, spot irregularities, notice hidden doors, and sense when architecture was lying to them, which is such a quietly brilliant bit of design. Dwarves don't just live underground, they understand the stone and the works that built their lands. They notice things that others miss because stone is so heavily part of their cultural language. 3.5 also cemented dwarves as excellent fighters, clerics, and paladins, not because they were flashy, but because, once again, they were dependable. You knew what you were getting. You knew that they would hold the line. And you also knew that they were most likely going to be the one that survived long enough for that to matter and for them to bring you back from the brinks of death. This is also the edition where dwarves leaned the hardest into the idea of tradition as strength. They weren't slow because they were outdated, they were deliberate. Once they committed to something, well, they did it properly. Then the 4th edition came, and the 4th edition dwarves were just frankly terrifying. This was the edition that looked at dwarves and said, what if we made them even harder to move? Mechanically, 4E dwarves were absolute juggernauts. They were resistant to forced movement, hard to knock prone, and extremely good at staying exactly where they wanted to be. If a 4E dwarf decided they were holding a doorway, well, that doorway was now theirs, permanently. Culturally, not much changed. And that's actually interesting, because whilst elves and other races were split into new categories and reimagined, dwarves just stayed dwarfs. The designers didn't feel the need to reinvent them because the core fantasy already worked. Dwarves in 4E felt like a promise that this character just will not let you down. They might not be the fastest and, well, they may not be the flashiest, but they will still be standing when everyone else isn't. And by the time we reach the 5th edition and its now new sibling, the 5.5, dwarves are one of the most stable designs in the entire game. They haven't been overcreated. English is my first language. Come on, they haven't been corrected. They haven't been overcorrected. They haven't been flattened, and they haven't been reinvented beyond recognition. Instead, 5e treats dwarves with a quiet respect. They are still tough, resilient, and traditional. But now those traditions feel like a choice rather than a restriction. Dwarves can be scholars, artists, diplomats, spellcasters, and wanderers without losing their identity. They don't have to abandon their culture to grow. They can carry it with them. And that, in itself, is a true good design. Modern D&D dwarves feel like people shaped by history rather than being trapped by it. They honour their past, but they're not stuck in it. And that evolution feels completely earned for this species. Dwarves come in many flavours, and each one thinks theirs is the correct one. One of my most favorite things about dwarves in D&D is that for a species so obsessed with tradition, unity, and clan loyalty, they absolutely cannot agree on how to be dwarves. Ask 3 dwarves where the true dwarven homeland is, and you'll get 5 answers, 2 grudges, and 1 historical correction delivered with frightening intensity. Dwarven subraces aren't just mechanical differences, it's cultural fault lines. Geography, resources, ancient grudges, religious schematics, and centuries of living in different environments that have shaped them into distinct people who all insist they are doing it correctly. So let's start with the core ones. These are the ones that most people meet first. So we start with the mountain dwarves that are built like brick walls. These dwarves are what most people picture when they think dwarf. They're broad, solid, armoured like a walking bunker, and built like they were personally carved from a god who said, "Yes, but what if we made it sturdier?" Mountain dwarves come from harsh, high-altitude environments, deep mountain halls, carved into unforgiving stone. Their culture reflects that strength is respected, endurance admired, and survival is well assumed. They don't do things halfway. They don't rush. They don't complain. Well, at least not publicly. Mountain dwarves are often warriors, smiths, defenders, and leaders, not because they crave authority, but because someone has to stand at the front when the tunnel collapses or the giants are come knocking. Mechanically, this is reflected in their physical prowess, stronger builds, armor familiarity, and a general, "you'll have to do harder than that" attitude towards danger. Culturally, mountain dwarves tend to value honor through action. You prove yourself by doing the work. Talking about your feelings is optional, and carrying a grudge for 3 generations is not. Well, then, we come to their cousins, the hill dwarves, who are often overshadowed by the mountain cousins. Which is ironic, really, because hill dwarves are arguably the most reliant of them all. They come from gentler environments, rolling hills, foothills, and fertile valleys, but don't mistake gentler for easier. Hill dwarves learned early on that survival is not about brute force, it's about endurance and patience, knowing when to keep going even when you're tired. Hill dwarves lived longer. They are heartier and a lot more community focused. Where mountain dwarves built fortresses, well, hill dwarves built homes. And so when it comes to defending borders, well, you want the mountain dwarves. And when it comes to maintaining traditions, well, that's the hill dwarves' job. They are often healers, artisans, clerics, and, well, leaders who keep things running smoothly between the scenes. They are the ones making sure that the clan survives the winter and who remembers everyone's name and who carries the emotional weight of everyone they meet. Hill dwarves are the kind of people who don't shout about their strength, but they will keep standing long enough after everyone else has sat down. And so, those are the 2 core ones, but we have got a lot more. We have the Faerûn dwarves. These are the ones that came a lot later than the mountain and hill cousins. We have the gold dwarves, shield dwarves, arctic and wild ones, as well as the Draga. We will start with our gold dwarves. They are deeply associated with wealth and craftsmanship and also have a very strong sense of cultural pride, just like all their other brothers and sisters. They often are portrayed as the most prosperous of the dwarven societies, with sprawling underground cities, complex trade networks, and an unshakable belief that dwarven culture represents civilization at its finest. And here's the thing, that pride doesn't come from arrogance, it comes from survival. Gold dwarves rebuilt again and again. After everything fell, they rebuilt, and it's become more adapted, expanded, and just shows their endurance completely within their culture. They value stability, legacy, and order. A gold dwarf isn't impressed by flashy heroics. They're impressed by your consistency. And by showing up every day and making something that lasts, well, you'll get their admiration. And they are also very aware of their history. Gold dwarves know exactly how much they've lost and regained over the centuries. And this knowledge informs every decision they make. They don't see losing as losing, they see it as a chance to rebuild and be stronger. Then we have our shield dwarves. And these ones, well, they are complicated. They are a people shaped by loss. They were once rulers of vast underground kingdoms. The shield dwarves saw their realms fall to invasions, eternal collapse, and monsters from the deep. They lost their halls, their homes, and their sense of certainty. But instead of giving up, they adapted. Shield dwarves rebuilt closer to the surface. They are the ones that mostly integrated into other cultures. They became pragmatic and flexible and more willing for change, not because they wanted to, but because their survival demanded it. This makes shield dwarves fantastic to roleplay. They live with the memory of what was lost and the reality of what must be built next. They honor tradition, but they don't cling too tightly to the past and their culture in case that it could destroy them. There's a quiet grief to the shield dwarves that doesn't get explored as often as you would think it would be, and it most certainly should be. Then we come to our Arctic and wild dwarves. These are ones that exist in environments that actively try to kill them, whether it be frozen tundras, the harsh wilderness, where there's deserts and rocky mountains and things where there is scarce resources. Somehow they survive and their cultures are leaner and harsher, and they are often the most misunderstood by other dwarves. They don't have time for luxury and gold. They don't have time to waste their effort on trying to engineer something new. And they don't romanticize their suffering either. They just simply endure it. And these dwarves remind us that dwarven culture isn't monolithic. It's shaped by the land and climate and necessity. So if you have a dwarven culture that is in the tundra, they're not going to look towards gold and shiny objects. They're going to be more focused on, well, building things that work well in their environment compared to their other cousins. And a quick note on the Dreiga. We need to talk about the Dreiga, but not today and not properly. The Dreiga are not just evil dwarves. They are dwarves shaped by enslavement, trauma, psionic experiments, and generations of abuse under the Mind Flayers. To talk about Dreiga without first talking about Mind Flayers would be irresponsible, and I refuse to do them that disservice. So Dreiga will get their own episode, a proper one with context and respect that they deserve. What makes a dwarf a dwarf? Dwarven traits are less about biology and more about philosophy. Dwarves value craftsmanship over speed, endurance over flash, loyalty over charm, and tradition over novelty. They believe that worth is proven through effort, that history matters, and that things should be built to last, like solid oak furniture. They are stubborn, but not without reason. When you've lived for centuries and seen trends rise and fall, you stop chasing every new idea. You trust what has worked before. Dwarves are slow to trust, and once they do, they are fiercely loyal. Betray that loyalty and, well, you'll never escape it. Their son's daughter's daughter, on for generations, will remember that betrayal, and your bloodline will have an enemy for life. They don't forget or forgive easily, a bit like elephants, and, well, but they will remember kindness for just as long. How do you play dwarves without being a caricature? Well, if you want to play a dwarf well, here's a real secret. Don't play the beard, play the history. Every dwarf carries generations of stories, expectations, and unspoken rules. They grew up hearing tales of loss and endurance, not as distant legends, but as family history. They were taught that work has value, that promises matter, and that your name means something long after you're gone. This shapes everything about how a dwarf moves in the world. So, for example, how dwarfs show their love and affection isn't usually verbal, and they do love deeply. I will add that. But they show their care through action. A dwarf might show their affection or appreciation of a party member through fixing their gear without being asked, standing watch so that they can rest, making something specifically for you, and remembering small practical details. For example, you might not like a dash of lemon in your water where everyone else does, so they miss that out. They might remember your favorite um, pudding. They might remember your favorite drink and specifically get that for you without you having to ask, as well as they stay with you when things get difficult. They don't say, I care about you. They say, you are not alone. And when it comes to friendships and party dynamics, well, dwarves are slow to trust. But once they do, that loyalty is absolute. In a party, dwarves often become the anchor, the one who plans ahead, questions reckless ideas, and notices when something feels wrong. They may clash with impulsive companions at first, but they respect the consistency and competence. If you show up, pull your weight, and keep your word, well, a dwarf will stand by you without hesitation. Then that brings us to the real question. For a species so caught up with tradition and loyalty, well, why would a dwarf go on adventure anyway? And not every dwarf leaves home because something went wrong. Maybe their adventure begins because they're fulfilling an oath. They've been given the task by their clan. They want to earn a name of their very own. They're repaying a debt. Or they might be just looking for knowledge to write down and bring home. Adventure to a dwarf is rarely an escape. It's duty. It's legacy in motion. And dwarves are stubborn. Yes. But that stubbornness comes with long memories and hard-earned lessons. They've seen what happens when things fall apart. Let them be gruff, but let them care. Because when everything goes wrong, the dwarf is the one who sighs, rolls up their sleeves and says, right, let's get to work. We need to talk about the beards. Before we summarize dwarves and roast them lovingly, we need to stop. We need to pause and sit down, and we need to talk about the beards. Because you cannot talk about dwarves without addressing the absolute overwhelming cultural phenomenon that is the beard. In D&D, a dwarf's beard is not just hair, it's history, it's identity, status, craftsmanship, and sometimes a legally binding document. A dwarf's beard represents age and experience and its honour. The longer and more carefully maintained it is, the more it silently communicates about who that dwarf is and what they've lived through. You don't just grow a beard, well, you earn it, you shape it, you braid it and decorate it, and you pass techniques down through the families. In some dwarven cultures, beard braids mark major life events. Victories, losses, oaths taken and oaths broken. There are braids for mourning, marriage, and war. A dwarf who shaves their beard is not trying a new look. They're making a statement, and quite possibly a very devastating one. And this applies regardless of gender. Dwarves of all genders can have beards. This isn't a joke or a gimmick, it's how dwarves are. Hair growth in dwarves is culturally and biologically normalized across the board. The obsession with beards is less about masculinity and more about lineage and pride. And also, this is just important. Dwarves put effort into their beards. They'll have oils and combs and braids reinforced with metal or gold clasps and rings. The beads are engraved with clan symbols, and I refuse to believe that a dwarf's beard does not require more maintenance than most adventure parties combined. So when someone jokes about, haha, dwarf beard, remember, this beard is a resume and it's seen things, and if you disrespect it, well, the dwarf will remember, and possibly longer than you live. Anyway, thank you for coming to my beard talk. Now let's continue. How can we explain them in a simplistic and possibly badly way? Well, let's run through the list. Dwarves are walking brick walls, emotionally constipated granddads, medieval engineers, living history books, professional grudge holders, and we've always done it this way personified. They don't rush, bend easy, and they don't trust your new idea. But if the world is ending and you need someone to stand their ground, well, you want a dwarf. In conclusion, dwarves are one of the most deeply human species in D&D. They feel loss, value legacy, and they fear change. Not because it's bad, but because they've seen what happens when things fall apart. They endure, rebuild, and remember. And in a fantasy genre full of immortal elves, chaotic gods, well, dwarves remind us that survival itself is an act of courage. So thank you for watching episode 2 of D&D Explained Badly. Next time, we can go softer or we can go worse. What do you want? Tieflings, dragonborns, tabaxi, mind flayers, the Draga? Well, let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and support your local kobold. I'm Sophia from the Kobold Guild. Stay creative, stay stubborn, and I will see you next time.